Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm really excited today because it's been quite a while since we've had a Storytime episode, and we've got a story for you in store for today, which is great news. Now, this story is actually one that I have known of since I was a young boy. It was actually a story that was shared to me by my martial arts sensei, my jiu-jitsu sensei. And it's one that I've kept with me. It was in an old manual that he had given us, and I had kept it through the years. And every now and then I'd kind of rediscover it and sit with it and just really enjoyed it. And finding it again recently helped me realize what an effect it had on me over the years in terms of how I approach practice, how I approach life, even though it is essentially looking at a very specific perspective, and that is to say Zen Buddhism. It still has some universal ideas in it that I really appreciate. Now, the story originally comes from an old book on swordplay coming from the 17th century. Where I think that my teacher got it from was from D.T. Suzuki in his book, Zen and Japanese Culture. Now, this story for me has altered a little bit over the years as I've told it, but the essential core of it remains the same. So I'd like to share it all with you today. Once upon a time, there was a swordsman called Shoken. And in his house, he noticed that he had a very large rat that had decided to take up residence in his house. And it was starting to cause all kinds of mischief. It was coming out in broad daylight, running across his floor, knocking things over, getting into his food. So he decided to send his own cat after this rat. And his own house cat was essentially completely humiliated by this rat. The rat attacked her, and the cat went running back in the opposite direction. And so right away, Shoken knew that he'd have to bring out the big guns for this one, that this was no ordinary rat. So what he did is he called for all the toughest cats in the neighborhood, right? All the nastiest alley cats that are proficient in catching rats, that are known for how good they are at capturing and killing rats. And he called them all to his house. In a group of some pretty ferocious and fierce looking cats arrive at his house. And he explains the situation, and one by one, each of these cats goes into his house, and one by one, they are humiliated by this rat and come back out completely defeated and dejected from their encounter with this so-called mighty rat. Well, at this point, Shoken is pretty furious. He's like, look, my cat's not doing anything. These so-called great cats at hunting rats couldn't do anything. They were all humiliated. I am a samurai. I will have to do this myself, and I will go ahead and defeat this rat. So he goes and grabs his wooden practice sword, and he starts to chase after the rat, trying to hit it with his sword. But this rat is so fast that it's anticipating every one of his moves. Now, this only makes Shoken more frustrated because he's like, man, I'm a samurai. This thing's a rat. Like, how on earth? There's no way that I can let this rat beat me. So he is just acting a fool and running around his house, trying to knock this rat with the sword. And he ends up knocking over all of his own stuff, bumping into things. I mean, by the end of it, he's covered in sweat, completely dejected. And the rat even has the gall to jump on his head and smack him with his feet, and the samurai can do nothing about it. So at this point, he's feeling not so great about himself, and he decides, okay, well, as a last resort, I've heard of this amazing cat from a nearby village that's famous for her ability to catch rats. So Shoken goes ahead and he calls for this famous cat, who then shortly thereafter arrives. And when the cat comes, there's nothing particularly special looking about the cat. Shoken remarks that it's quite an ordinary looking cat. Nothing about it seems like it would be a great rat catcher. He's quite thoroughly underwhelmed, but he says, fine, okay, if this is the famous cat, then go ahead, go on in there and catch this rat for us. And so the cat kind of nonchalantly walks into the room, and when the rat spies this cat, he's frozen. He's overcome by inexplicable fear. He can't move. And the cat still doesn't even seem bothered, doesn't even seem to acknowledge the rat or acknowledge what's going on, just kind of waltzes into the room, kind of gets close enough to the rat, and then without any notice, just reaches out, grabs the rat, bites it, kills it, done. Grabs it by the neck, carries it outside to the rest of the cats and to Shoken, the swordsman. Well, this just absolutely confounded everybody, and they were all very thrilled. So they said, well, look, we are going to throw a feast tonight in your honor. Would you please come be our guest? And we would love to hear about how you caught this rat. And that evening, all the cats gather. Shoken gathers, they're all at his house, and they have this big feast, and they bring in the veteran cat as the cat of honor. And they sit down and they say, look, we are all cats renowned for our ability and skills in catching rats. Yet we were all humbled by this great rat. Yet you came in and were in and out, completely victorious in no time at all. Please, we want to know how you did this. Like, for the sake of cats everywhere, tell us, please, so that we can know and better ourselves through this knowledge. But first, let us each introduce ourselves to you and tell us about our ways and methods of capturing rats. So the first cat comes up, and it's a black cat. And the cat says, like, look, I'm from a family that's famous for its skill in the art of catching rats. I've trained for this since I was born. I can jump 7 feet high. I can fit through the tiniest little spaces that only the smallest of rats can fit through. I can do the backflip, half twist, over the opponent's slice. I can even trick rats into thinking that I'm asleep. And then, when they get close enough, I snatch them and I get them. But I had never been defeated before this rat. And the old veteran cat, just listening, nodding its head, and says, well, what you've learned is technique, and technique is fine. Right? The great masters teach us technique to orient us, to get our feet wet. But if you spend all of your time on technique, on cleverness, you'll miss the whole point. Right? Your mind will always be busy trying to discern which technique will be appropriate in combat. And that contrived thinking process will slow you down. It will make you less effective. And with technique, there's always someone with better technique, or even the perfect technique to combat or counteract your technique. And so all the cats listened, nodded, and a striped cat stands up. He says, I hear what you're saying about technique. And I think that the most important aspect of the art is the life force, the spirit, right? What we would call chi in Chinese, or ki in Japanese. We might even call it prana shakti in yoga. Right? And the rat says, I've spent my entire life cultivating my chi. I have the strongest chi of any cat. And it kind of reminds me of a modern political figure. It's like, hey, I've got the best chi. Like, everybody knows how great my chi is. Believe you me, I've got the greatest chi of any cat. right? And the cat continues. He says, even before I meet my opponent, I'll focus all of my chi on them, and my victory is already assured. And I don't plan my moves. I move spontaneously. And I don't use any technique to catch the rats. But this rat wasn't even in the least bit bothered or disturbed or affected by me. I just don't understand it. And so the wise veteran cat, listening to the striped cat speak and finish, stands up and says, well, you've got a strong spirit, a strong psyche. Great. But the very fact that you were conscious of it, that you know that you have a strong spirit, works against you. Right? Your spirit stands in opposition to your opponents, and you can never really be sure who has the stronger spirit. And that doubt, that lack of being sure, creates a shadow. Right? It's something that you don't really care to see. And not only that, but your big spirit, your big energy casts itself its own form of shadow. The bigger it is, the bigger the shadow. And look, you've forced this cultivation of your chi with your mind, with your focus. It hasn't naturally arisen. It hasn't spontaneously arisen. It's rooted in your mind, not in the source, not in the Tao, the way. Right? You're like this small creek that floods with power during a rainstorm, but quickly exhausts itself after the rain. Unlike a mighty river that's connected to its source, that's always providing a continuous flow, a continuous stream, no matter what. Right? Because it's not real spirit then. It's a shadow of spirit because it's not really coming from the source. Your spirit, your chi that you speak of isn't actually rooted in the source. It's been inflated by your mind. And really, at that point, not only can it be overcome by somebody with greater spirit than yours, but it's easily going to be overcome by those that are connected to source. And I tell you what, a desperate rat fighting for its life, not caring whether or not it gets hurt, but only caring about escape, can often prove stronger than any cat. And I don't care how strong your spirit is, when you come up against something that is cornered like that is fighting for its life, it will reach deep down into the source and find its strength. The cats nod and they're all kind of looking around like, yes, like we're hearing this. And so now the gray cat stands up, says, I hear you, right? A big ego, a big powerful psyche, all this strong spirit, it casts a big shadow. Right? Somebody is going to be able to take advantage of that shadow somehow. Right? There's always somebody with better technique or the technique that's designed to defeat you, and there will always be somebody with more spirit, right? Or someone that can take advantage of the shadow of your spirit. Ultimately, that'll be your downfall. So I have disciplined myself with this in mind. I don't prop myself up. I don't try to force a fight. I'm not projecting myself out into everyone else. I'm passive. I'm yielding. I allow the opponent's own force to be used against them. I'm like a sheet that envelops a stone that's thrown at it. Man, but that rat today, that rat has no parallel. It's a mysterious creature, the likes of which I have never seen before. And so the wise veteran cat stands up and says, this yielding that you speak of is not actually in harmony with nature. You're forcing it. It's contrived. It's an idea that you have in your mind. Right? The idea that you will yield to your opponent's power is a block in your own mind. It prevents you from being authentic and spontaneous, natural in the moment. By forcing it, by saying, I am going to yield to my opponent's force to overcome them ultimately, is just a gimmick. It's artificial, right? It's only going to continue to cloud your mind and disconnect you from the authenticity of the moment. But look, said the veteran cat, I'm not going to say, however, that all the discipline that you've cultivated has been for nothing. Right? The way, the Tao, expresses itself through everyone. Technique holds reason in it. Spiritual power operates in the body. And when we're connected to the moment, in harmony with nature, everything acts perfectly as it needs to. But herein lies the problem for each of you. Self-conscious thought. When you are thinking of yourself, when you are self-conscious, your acts are self-willed. They're forced. That is not in conformity with the Tao, the way. You must find a state of no-mindedness or mindlessness, we call mushin. When your mind is empty, you're united with nature, with the Tao, and there is nothing artificial, nothing forced. But to talk about the Tao, it's all just words. The Tao is beyond any words. We could talk forever, and one still can't perfectly describe the Tao. Now, a long time ago, the veteran cat told them, in a village where I grew up, there was a master cat. She spent almost all of her time sleeping. You couldn't even tell that she had any spiritual power. She just laid there all day long, looking like a wooden log, like a statue. But whenever she went anywhere, no rat dared to come anywhere near her. And one day I went to her and I asked her about this. I said, why is this so? But she gave no answer. And I asked her 4 times and still no answer. But it's not that she was unwilling to answer. It was simply that she didn't know how to answer. It goes with the old saying that one who knows speaks not a word, while one who speaks knows not. And that cat was forgetful of the self. She didn't have a concept or an idea of an individual self. She was in that state of mushin, of no-mindedness, this highest spiritual state of purposelessness. And she had discovered and realized divine warriorship. I could never be compared to that cat. She's too great. Now at this point, the swordsman Shoken, who'd been listening to this whole experience as if in a dreamlike trance, right? He stands up and he says, look, I've been training in swordsmanship my entire life, but I've yet to master its essence. And I've learned a lot tonight about different ways of training and thinking and being. But if I may ask, please tell me the innermost secrets. And the old veteran cat said, look, I'm a cat. And I'm a cat that eats rats for food, right? What do I know about human affairs? But tell you what, if you'll permit me to say something just a little bit, you have to remember that swordsmanship is the art of realizing at the most critical moment the reason of life and death. The purpose of swordsmanship is not just to defeat your opponent, it's to realize the reason of life and death. And so a samurai must always be mindful of this and discipline himself in not only the technique of swordsmanship, but in a spiritual culture, in a way of being. And once he understands the reason of life and death, his mind is free of selfishness. He's not afraid, he's not grasping, he's not holding on to his ego. And at that moment, he has no doubts, no distracting thoughts. He's not trying to figure out and be clever and outwit his opponent. Spirit itself is moving through him. And he's able to freely respond to whatever changes are taking place in the moment to moment, adapting, not through force of mind, but through the sheer force of spirit. And the veteran cat tells all of them, he's like, look, I mean, it's not to say that none of this other stuff works at all. I mean, obviously it's doing something, but every time that you're victorious, it's really more of an accident than really anything about the spirit of swordsmanship itself. And he says, let me say too that when I say purposelessness or no-mindedness, I don't mean like just this dull, vacant nothingness. I'm not talking about there being no sensitivity to the experience and you're just like this dull being, but rather to say that when the mind attaches itself to objects, right? If anything is held in the mind, then your mental energy, your psychic energy is drawn to it, right? Anytime that energy is being pulled to something, it loses its balance. And it has a disconnection from the true source itself because you put something in the way of that. It's like it's written in the I Ching, the book of changes. It says, there is in it no thinking, no doing or no willing, absolute quietness and no motion. But it feels. And when it acts, it flows through any objects and events in the world. And so the veteran cat said, when you understand this in connection with the art of swordsmanship, you will be closer to the Tao, closer to the way. Because in that moment, there is no subject, there is no object, there is no separation, there is no difference. There is only the Tao, there is only spirit itself. And so Shoken, the swordsman, listens to all the wisdom of the cat and asks the question, well, but what do you mean by no subject or no object? And so the veteran cat says, well, the moment that there is a self, there is a foe. And when there is no self, there is no foe. And so anytime that something exists in separation, it has an opposite. There is a male, there is a female, there is a dark, there is a light, there is a fire, there is a water. There's these things working in opposition together. And so long as you identify with one thing over another, you will always exist in opposition to it. The idea is to clear your mental state of these obstructions, of these oppositions, and you can then completely reside in this state of doing nothingness, as it were. It's nothing, but it's something. It's a potency. It's like a tiger resting there, then all of a sudden pouncing. The energy for it is always there. It's just not being expressed or demonstrated all the time. What excites it into action, what excites it into actual action itself is the prompting of the universe. It's spontaneous. When something else happens, there's that immediate response to it because it's natural. There's no obstructions. There's nothing getting in the way of that response to the moment. Now, the grand old veteran cat says something really great here. He says, look, this is all I can really explain. Right? The master's task can't go beyond transmitting technique. All right, or explaining the reason why you need the technique. But it's you that must realize truth. Right? Like I can show you the door, but you've got to walk through the door. You've got to open it and walk through it. I can't do that for you. I can say, look, there's a door. This is how you're going to open a handle. And this is why you might want to walk through that door. But you've got to do it because it has to be self-realized. It can't be something, another block in the mind, another thought in the mind that will only obstruct you in the moment. It has to be self-realized. Truth must be self-attained. It doesn't come from another. Right? You can have the teacher-student relationship. You can learn things from books and scripture and particular lineages and forms and all this sort of stuff, and that's fine. But the true realization must come from something that is beyond the mind. And no one else can do that for you. No one can force that on you. It comes from within. And the veteran cat says something really great. He says, teaching is not difficult. Listening is not difficult. What's truly difficult is to become conscious of what you have inside yourself and be able to use it as your own. That self-awakening, that's Satori, right? That's the ideal state that comes when you really can see into your own being, this self-realized experience of truly knowing yourself, and then being able to put it into action spontaneously and naturally in the moment, so nothing is forced or contrived or fixed. This is the true essence of the teaching. So that is the story of the swordsman and the cat. And I like it on so many different levels, right? Because it's giving us examples of like, hey, don't get too caught up in the physical, or don't get too caught up in the techniques of things, right? I used to be a technique junkie. Like I wanted to get all these different techniques from all these different traditions so that I could learn all this different stuff and get all the secrets from this guy and that guy. And I was obsessed with technique. But I mean, one technique is all that's really needed, if that's even needed. It was Bruce Lee who said something to the effect of, don't be afraid of the guy that's practiced 1,000 kicks one time. Be afraid of the guy who's practiced one kick 1,000 times. As well, though, it's giving us some insight into not to get too caught up in all of the so-called energetic techniques as well, of like, oh, let me raise my kundalini, let me do all this sort of stuff. Like that is somehow going to then solve all of life's problems. That if I were just to open up my heart chakra, that everything would be okay. It's also saying that the attitude that like, I'm just going to be yielding to everything. Or one might even say, we could really see this in our kind of modern language of it, is going with the flow, right? If your concept of life is to just, hey man, I'm going with the flow. That's what the veteran cat was talking about here, about it being forced and contrived. You're saying that you're going to do it. You're thinking that you're going to do it. And that in and of itself means it's not natural anymore, because you're creating this idea of what it's supposed to look like and what it's supposed to be like, instead of genuinely responding to the moment spontaneously and authentically. And so what we get pointed back towards again simply is that connection to source. And I mean, there's so many different names that people and traditions have given that source over the course of human history, perhaps longer, because who knows. But the real point of it all is to be connected to that. Connected to that source. And yes, techniques can help, and those energetics can help, and kind of learning to yield to things can all help, but really there's something so much more than the techniques and all the self-cultivation stuff. You see cases like this within yoga all the time, of these amazing saints who just kind of spontaneously realized truth, and then they lived in that state the rest of their lives. Right? It didn't come from, going up to a cave and doing 40 years of practicing this one particular technique or 20 different types of techniques. It was just like a flowering, a blossoming of truth that came by being connected to that source. Or we could say revealing that connection to the source, or perhaps even more appropriately, when the obstructions, when the things getting in the way of that connection, that flow to source, were dissolved or removed, those people became self-realized. And this is a state that almost all spiritual traditions, at least on the mystical side, encourage us to abide in, to dwell in some senses to seek after, because they say that is that absolute state of being free of suffering, free of life and death. This is the immortality that so many traditions speak of, because you were beyond time. You're no longer afraid of life and death. You're completely immersed in the moment. And I love that because, again, even though this is a Zen story and it's talking about samurai and things like that, and the original story, I'm sure, has a few more key concepts and words thrown in there. But really, I think what it allows us an opportunity to do is to remember not to get too clever with ourselves, to get too caught up in this technique and that technique, or this idea of ourselves and that idea of ourselves, and really recognize that the whole purpose here is to connect to that source. And again, it doesn't matter what you name it, what you call it, connect to it. Every time a block comes up between you and that source, what can you do to remove it, to let it go, to let it dissolve away? And that's where real cultivation is. Well, anyways, I hope you've enjoyed listening to that story as much as I have telling it. It's an old favorite of mine. Thank you all so much for listening today. I hope you all have a very present, connected moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here. I want to take a quick moment for a special thank you to our incredible sound engineer, Zach Cooper. Not only does he do all the work on the interview episodes, but he really makes the story episodes come to life, and I'm really appreciative of all the work that he does. As well, don't forget to go and check into our weekly contests over at savannahspirit.com. You can find and enter the contest at www.savannahspirit.com/contest. Find out the information there as well. And don't forget to join our Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, look up Savannah East. It's the same name as our blog, which I also encourage you to check out. As always, thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.